anecdote. When I was traveling around China in, 2019, I noticed I didn't go to any of the major cities, all like third tier, fourth tier cities, as they're called. And I noticed there was not a single gas powered scooter, tons of scooters everywhere, but all of them were electric. And I thought, that's weird. I never heard of that. So I talked to people and they said, yeah, a couple of years ago, the government had a subsidy program where we could trade in our gas powered scooters and get a discount on electric scooters. So it's just an example of how, when the government has a policy goal, they're much more open to radical policy to really accomplish something. Whereas, as you know, in the US, any sort of radical idea like that would run into all sorts of moneyed opposition. Anyone who stands to lose money from a transition to, say, electric scooters or electric cars or whatever the question is, they can put up significant roadblocks to prevent that. Whereas in China, they're like, no, we're not going to allow the power of money to easily be transferred into political power so that they can do policies like that.
Now, what do you attribute that to? I mean, obviously, everybody who is a staunch capitalist to the bitter end is going to say, well, it's communism and that's the reason. But I'm sure that's probably not the reason. There is something to be said for Eastern culture versus Western culture when it comes to the collective and recognizing what's best for society. How would you describe it?
Yeah, I would describe it as a mixture of capitalism and socialism.
Yeah.
I think first of all, people who say that China is hyper communist and super socialist, I think they're being hyperbolic. I think that's way too extreme.
Well, one thing I can assure you, Kareem, that anybody who makes a statement like that has never stepped foot on China soil.
Exactly.
Guaranteed.
They don't know the definitions of these words. So, yes, sorry.
Yeah, exactly. The people who shout the loudest, Marxists, communists, often have no idea what they're talking about. But on the other hand, China is also not fully capitalist in that sense. China is a very interesting hybrid, you could say. Some would say that they're still transitioning towards socialism. I think Peter is a believer of that idea. I am not very convinced yet. I think there needs to be more of a stronger working class movement to push the country towards socialism. I do not see that at the moment. But what is indeed interesting in China is that the Communist Party does control the economy and also the billionaires within that economy. So it decides where to put growth. So if you need growth in green energy, China invests in that, and that has a tremendously positive impact on the society. While in the West, it doesn't matter what you want. If the billionaire class says no, it's just not going to happen. And they're just I don't know if I can swear on this show, by the way.
Oh, you certainly can, and I would appreciate if you answer.
Please in English, or I won't understand.
Yeah. No, of course. No, I said in the billionaire class in the West, it doesn't matter what we say. They just go on and fucking up our societies, and it's just not stopping. And somebody who says you cannot criticize the government in China, and that is enough for any person who values freedom. Well, I think we don't have much of a right to talk about that stuff when we have young students being thrown into jail because they write an op-ed piece about Israel. I just find that so incredibly hypocrite. It's the same as people who say like, oh, MBS is coming in visiting Netanyahu, visiting Donald Trump. And I'm like, what is weird about that? Is a terrorist like Donald Trump above MBS? Or when, I mean, he's meeting Netanyahu, for Christ's sake. He's meeting a genocidal maniac, and we complain about MBS. We have that weird kind of, you can say that, hypocrisy in the West, where we complain about other societies without looking at our own societies. And this is another example. And to be honest, yes, you can criticize China. Peter and I do it all the time. We live in China. Our colleagues at the universities do it. They talk about policy. They talk about what they don't like. But on the other hand, I think, and probably Chinese people know about that better, what you can and cannot say. No, that is true. I think there are some things you cannot say. I don't know what that is. I think maybe more personal political opinions. I don't know, Peter. Maybe you know more about that. But I do know about policy. There's a lot of debate in China.
Yeah, I mean the research from several years ago was looking at internet comments. You're perfectly free to criticize the hell.
Can I freeze you for 1 second, Pete?
Yeah.
Just for 1 second. If you're going to come on our channel and create multiple accounts and put in the same message like everyone's getting caught for doing now,
trolls?
I'm not feeding trolls. I'm just pointing out that there are bot accounts everywhere. So you have to critique the message ever so slightly to make it seem like you actually are not copying and pasting. I just telling you, I catch everything. So good try.
Sorry. Continue.
No, as I was saying, yeah, the research from several years ago is that people criticize the government all they like, and whatever they're criticizing. The thing that gets clamped down on are attempts to organize IRL. Like the government is worried about people forming a kind of alternative organization that potentially could be the base for counter-revolution. So that was the result of research several years ago. I haven't heard anything that has changed.
Something that
to be very honest, if I can add one more thing,
Yeah.
to be very honest, one of the reasons Peter and myself feel very good at the university here in China is that we do a lot of work on imperialism and a lot of wars, imperialism, etc., etc. I feel more free and more safe to do that kind of work over here than I would be in the Netherlands and talk about, for example, the colonial history or the currently imperial NATO and that kind of stuff. I think I would not even get a job probably at one of the universities.
Oh,
So
yeah,
that-
totally.
Yeah, that leads me into I kind of have two things I want to say. One thing that I had heard about that's very cool, and I don't know if you guys know about this, but as somebody who lives in South Florida, we have consistent building and overdevelopment in low-lying areas that are already very water insecure in terms of fresh water and all of these things. And the capitalism is just, they can't build enough. They don't care where the resources are going to come from. They don't care if it's going to be flooded. Whoever's left holding that bag, that's their problem. And something I had heard about in China, maybe you can tell me if this is true, that the government there has invested and subsidized people and subsidized them in a way to encourage people to get out of climate vulnerable places and move to places that are less vulnerable to climate crisis, flooding, whatever the different climate issues are there. And it made sense to me in terms of that there is more of a concern of the collective. So I was just curious if you know anything about that. Like, it just seems like one more thing where they're just going to be practical and reasonable in terms of what's in the best interest for the most people.
Yeah, I haven't read anything about that particularly, but it does very much sound like the Chinese government's MO. Like, I think the way I think about it most on a more abstract level is, if you've ever read Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes, he asks, why do the people create this Leviathan, this government, this massively powerful body that could destroy them? Why do they do that? And he's like, well, it's basically because you've got all of these little Leviathans, all these little bullies around in society that would otherwise cause mayhem and terror and dominate other people. And so that's why people create a Leviathan, so that the Leviathan can squish the other bullies so that they can live in peace. Well, basically the Chinese government is more like that Hobbesian Leviathan, where they do at least try to crush down the would-be bullies, the would-be dominators, like the real estate developers who would build tons of property right by the water that's fully expected to be submerged in 10, 15 years, because, they won't be holding the bag. IBG, YBG, I'll be gone, you'll be gone. Well, not the person who buys the house, you'll be screwed. So that kind of predatory, selfish behavior tends to be tamped down. I think it's fair to say, like on that kind of abstract level of the difference between the US government and its philosophy and the Chinese government and its philosophy.
I would be curious as to why you think there is so much saber rattling, when it comes to Taiwan, and why we feel the need to get involved. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious what Taiwan is all about. It's all about the South China Sea. It can't possibly be any other reason, because it's all about money and power. I mean, to me, the American empire is pretty transparent in what their intentions always are. That's why we're effing around with Venezuela at the same time, largest crude oil reserve in the entire world. Obviously, the international incident that Pelosi caused a few years back was insane. We're lucky that it didn't end up becoming something a lot worse. So what do you attribute our saber rattling with Taiwan and what that means for the future? Because thankfully, it hasn't become a focus of this administration as of yet. But who's to say, with how crazy things are, that it might not become?
They're focusing on China just in somewhere else. All of this Venezuela stuff, it all comes back to the trade thing and controlling that over China's initiative. But yeah, please explain that, because the Taiwan thing seems like just like a spark or an excuse.
Yeah, I would say that Venezuela. I just wrote an article on our Substack about Venezuela. I suspect that the Venezuela thing, the sudden threat of Venezuela, actually has to do with the preparation of a war with Iran. I think that when the Strait of Hormuz is being shut down, 20% of the oil transfers, I think then the United States will have the empire will have another source for oil. So I think we need to link these things. When it comes to Taiwan, anything, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's Hong Kong, whether it's Xinjiang, the United States will grab anything to try and wreak havoc in China, because China is a contender, and China is a contender that is not as capitalist. I say as capitalist as the United States. So China is, you could say, has these socialist influences and does not allow the billionaire class, the capitalist class, to have free reign. That is threatening. That is another system that's coming up, and the United States is very good at clamping down on alternative systems to maintain the hegemony of capitalism. And I think that is one of the reasons why the United States wants to see China destroyed, like all other societies. And my personal worry is that the Chinese may still not realize enough how serious the United States is. That is, that the United States really, really wants to destroy it. There is no way out. There's no we can be friends. We can find ways to clear. It's not going to happen. And I think there are still parts of the Chinese political class that still thinks they can be friends. And I think that's not going to happen.
Yeah, there's definitely a liberal ideological current within China that really wants to have capitalist democracy in their country, and there's been this current for quite a while. I think it's fair to say that they were pretty discredited around the time of the Great Financial Crisis, because they viewed the U.S. as the beacon of capitalist democracy, and then with that massive failure and the corresponding ideological failure, that the belief that markets would always self-regulate and it wouldn't be in anyone's interest to allow a massive bubble and dangerous derivatives, et cetera, et cetera. So I think to generalize, I think the liberal ideological current is kind of on the back foot in China. But your question was more about Taiwan and why the U.S. Is so interested. Yeah, I agree with Peter entirely. It's all about the South China Sea, but it's also just about domination. The U.S. ruling class has had total domination of the world since the collapse of the USSR, and they very much like that situation where they can basically give orders to any country in the world, and the pressure that they can exert on every country on the world is essentially such that the government has to accede to U.S. demands. Maybe they can negotiate a little bit, but the U.S. has arbitrary sway over other countries. The problem in their mind with China is that China has developed to the point where that arbitrary sway cannot be exerted. China can say, nope, we're not doing that. And that is the problem. That is the threat in the minds of our psychotic ruling class. And that's the major concern is getting that group of people out of power and having, because I was just saying to my students the other day, it's like you have a minuscule ideological minority in the US who believes that the world is a game of Risk, and they can, they want to play like on a chessboard and dominate the world. very few people in the US think like that. It's only the foreign policy elite. If you ask an average American on the street, and you tell them, how those people think, they'll react like these are crazy people. That's not at all a mainstream US belief. But those are the people that run the world because they are in control of US foreign policy.
I would agree. I would say that for the most part, the average American doesn't agree with how they're governed. And it's becoming more obvious that we are heading in that direction, which is why I think BRICS is a significant situation. It is taking away from the power structure that the U.S. has been so accustomed to for so long. But you can only poke the bear so many times before you start pushing certain nations that would otherwise be at odds very often and finding themselves agreeing on how can we cross-pollinate. And in the case of Russia and China, it's obvious that our actions over the past, it's hard to say when it really began. I personally think from a domestic policy perspective, Clinton is the worst president of my lifetime. And from a foreign policy perspective, Bush is the worst president of my lifetime. And the fact that they went back to back over a 16-year period, I would say that you put what happened right in the middle, which was, I believe, the true breaking of the trust with amongst the American people when the judicial branch decided to put the presidential candidate who did not actually win the election into the White House. There has been a division since that moment that has never been rectified or remedied. And so now everything is starting to come to a head. Policies that get passed one year don't get felt necessarily tomorrow. But of all the domestic policies that I say are maybe the absolute worst, and there's a lot of them, if Hillary Clinton had become president instead of Trump, the Trans-Pacific Partnership 1,000% would have been passed. However, the removal of Glass-Steagall by Clinton back in '99 is probably still the most significant in terms of where the banks really became this monolith of power that is too big to fail. And so now I wonder, how are those oligarchs here in the States and oligarchs from around the world who now come to the States to make their fortune off our backs? I always love Elon because he makes his fortune and then says the American people can't have health care, even though he had it when he grew up. Lots of people, especially the Brits, are like that as well. I am wondering from your perspective, is there going to be a reckoning of sorts with the power structure in this country as a result of BRICS? Do you see that happening in the near future?
Near future, I don't know. I'll be short here. I think near future, no, because basically the only powerful country within BRICS is China. You would need to have the development of unity among the BRICS bloc. And really, if you think of it in the United Nations terms, the G77, the grouping of the world's majority countries, underdeveloped peripheral countries in the world system, you would need to have a much greater degree of unity and cooperation. And then you would see something like the extraction of so many of these countries from under US domination. And of course, for our psychotic ruling class, they would view that as an existential threat. God knows how they would react, but hopefully they will be on the outs by then.
Yeah, I would say that also we all are, especially those who are from the West, such as ourselves, we are all desperately clinging on to hope. And I think BRICS was one of those things that really, really gave and gives us hope for some kind of alternative. But we had recently some interesting guests on our show, Professor Walden Bello, Professor Patrick Bond, but also Fiorella Isabel and Vanessa Beeley, who we often talk to, friends of the show. And they are all very, you could say, relatively critical, also quite nuanced. And I think we need that. We have been through a period of, I always say, BRICS hallelujah. We were in this hallelujah phase. We have this kind of alternative to imperialism, but increasingly there are more voices that say, okay, it's not really happening. Patrick Bond would even say they're sub-imperialist. That is, they often cooperate with the imperialism, with Western imperialism. And an example of that would be, for example, Vanessa Beeley would say how Russia operates in Syria, often deals with Israel and the United States, but also what we just recently saw in the UN, where China and Russia abstained from their what was it, the UNSC, the Security Council resolution, and which pretty much handed over the Palestinians to their killers. And I think this also happened in 2011, by the way, when there was a UNSC vote on Libya. And in that case, you can see that also BRICS nations in the global south often, in some way, shape, or form, cooperate with US, Western Israeli imperialism. So I have become a little bit more critical and nuanced, even though I am happy that there is this kind of alternative and that indeed China and Russia seem to be trading increasingly without the dollar. I think that is the most necessary thing if we want the empire to fall, that the dollar is not the world currency anymore. And yeah, but besides that, like Peter, I don't have my hopes too high at this moment.